Hi there and welcome back. In this video we're looking at a more advanced Python concept called typing. Python is what's known as a dynamic language. In a dynamic language, we don't specify what type of data a variable holds. For example, here we've got a cursor, and we're not saying that this cursor has to be a specific type like an integer or a string or a cursor object. In other programming languages, like Java for example, you would say cursor, this cursor has to be of type cursor, whatever class this is. But in Python you don't have to say that. Similarly, if you create a variable with the value 5, in Java you would have to say int x is 5, because that specifies that x has to be an integer at all times. And if you were to do this, you would get an error because the string 5 is not an integer. Java is a statically typed language, a language where you have to specify the type of variables as you create them. But Python is a dynamically typed language, which means you don't have to do that. It means you are a bit more flexible because your variable can change types between executions if you want. And also, there's a bit less code to write because you don't have to constantly define what every variable is. However, it also has some drawbacks. And the main drawback is that sometimes you can use a variable thinking it is one thing, but really it's something else. And you're not clear about that because you don't have anything that tells you what type it is. For example, if you have a variable called friends, and it's a tuple of your friends, at some point later on the program, maybe you forget it's a tuple, and down here you try to do friends.append something. Obviously this wouldn't work because you can't append on a tuple, but because you weren't seeing this code at that moment in time, you didn't realize that. That's one of the problems with dynamically typed languages like Python. So Python has introduced in Python 3 the concept of typing, where you can tell your editor, PyCharm, and some other third-party programs what your functions return and what your parameter types should be, so that when you're programming, it's a bit clearer what you're doing. Here's an example on how you might tell Python what your function returns. For example, this create book table returns none, and we know that because all Python functions return none by default if you don't include a return statement. So what can you do? You can tell Python that when you call this function, you expect it to return none. And you do this like so. After the function definition, but before the colon, you put this dash greater than none. Now when you go back to app.py, and you've got here database.createBookTable, you can say something like my variable equals that, but notice how now PyCharm gives you this squiggly line underneath and it says createBookTable doesn't return anything. Therefore, you probably don't want to assign it to a variable because that's pretty pointless, since the value is going to be none. If you remove the none, which you can do of course, it's totally optional, that now disappears because PyCharm is not aware that the function doesn't return anything. Okay, so again, you can include these type hints, that's what they're called, but they are not enforced by Python. These are only useful when you're developing in PyCharm or when you use a couple other pieces of software